With breakfast from BBC News starts Monday on BBC One and BBC News 24.
This is BBC One Scotland. Now the news, and reporting Scotland with Hugh Edwards and Jackie Bird. It's 6 o'clock.
Tony Blair stakes New Labour's claim to an historic second term. He tells Labour's conference he's got the message on pensions and he is listening. Also today, Jeffrey Archer charged with perjury and perverting the course of justice. Tears in Sydney as drugs make the headlines once again.
Also tonight, we bit off more than we could chew. The former boss of the SQA answers the questions on this summer's exams fiasco. And amid intense security, the Lockerbie prosecution's star witness finally takes the stand.
Good evening from Brighton. The Prime Minister has come out fighting here at the Labour Party conference. His leader speech this afternoon was for many the most powerful he's delivered since becoming leader. He took personal responsibility for the crisis of recent weeks and admitted the government had made people angry over pensions, fuel prices and the Millennium Dome. He said he was listening and that he would act. Mr Blair insisted that for schools, health and transport, New Labour had an ambitious programme for a second term of government. He promised a big battle with William Hague's Conservatives. Our correspondent Mark Mardell was watching the speech here in Brighton.
This is a testing moment for a leader who until now has basked in an unparalleled public approval. But we're now beginning to know what Tony Blair looks like under fire, a passionate defender of his cause. But first he had an admission. The government had taken a knock.
Yes, there are things that we have done that have made people angry, and we should be open enough, honest enough to admit it. The Dome, hindsight's a wonderful thing. If I had my time again, I would have listened to those who said governments shouldn't try to run big visitor attractions. 75p, I'll tell you now, as Gordon made crystal clear yesterday, we get the message.
He said he was listening, he heard, he would act, but not necessarily on petrol tax.
I am listening to people's anger over fuel duties. For hauliers, farmers, to say nothing of ordinary motorists, there is real hardship. But I also have to listen, and have had to listen over underfunding in the National Health Service. And I've listened to those pensioners who believe the government should give them a greater share of the country's prosperity. And I ask people, would it ever be right to choose a priority simply on the basis of a fuel blockade? What of those who can't protest, whose voice isn't supported by the media, who go neglected unless we speak for them?
Contrition out of the way, a fighting note sounded ever louder as Mr Blair went on. First ridicule for Mr Hague.
Opportunism always knocks for William Hague. You want tax cuts? Have them. Spending rises? Have them too. It all makes sense after 14 pints. In fact, everything makes sense after 14 pints. John Redwood looks sane. Michael Portillo looks loyal. There's even a possibility after 14 pints even William Hague could look like a Prime Minister.
But that was about the only joke. The tone was deliberately elevated. Mr Blair claimed the country faced a fork in the road, a decision of destiny. This was a preview of many election broadcasts to come, a list of cuts he claimed the Conservatives would make.
20,000 doctors cut, plus 20,000 prison officers cut, plus 40,000 nurses cut, plus 40,000 teachers cut, plus 40,000 police officers cut under the Tory cuts guarantee.
Next, a long list of achievements and ambitions, including the first promise for the next manifesto to increase the share of national income spent on education. And there'll be another crackdown on crime.
It is time for zero tolerance of the yob culture. Time to give the police powers to close pubs where there's fighting. Time to give them the power, without the endless hassle of forms and court bureaucracy, to issue fixed penalty fines for that loutish behaviour.
And the most personal passage off the issued text. Labour members are intensely suspicious of what he really believes, how far he'd go in cuddling up to Middle Britain. Mr Blair tried to reassure them.
By nature, I am a unifier. I'm a builder of consensus. I will do whatever I can to bring people on side, but there are certain things that I can't do. If you ask me to put tax cuts before education spending, I can't do it.
He said his aim was a Britain where every child could make the most of its God-given abilities.
That journey is a journey worth making. It is a fight worth fighting, and it is a fight we must win.
The standing ovation is almost obligatory, and whatever the country makes of this, the conference loved it.
The best speech I've heard in 60 years of attending conference.
He did say that he wasn't perfect, the government wasn't able to walk on water, that there had been errors. He mentioned the 75p for pensioners, he mentioned the dome. So that's as near as an apology as you'll probably get from a Prime Minister.
So, this is the fight back. Mr Blair and his senior ministers are convinced that the petrol crisis was not a general revolt about taxation, and they're happy to fight the next election as a sort of moral crusade about spending. The intriguing thing is, the Tories are relishing that battle as well. Mark Mardell, BBC News, Brighton.
As Mark was saying, Mr Blair's speech included several announcements on policy, including plans to improve cancer diagnosis and treatment and promising zero tolerance of what he called yob culture. Labour would introduce on-the-spot fines for drunken behaviour and tighter bail conditions to stop rapid reoffending. On health, there'll be a new cancer plan with 1,000 new cancer specialists taken on and nearly 300 new scanners in place within 6 years. Labour will invest £750 million of lottery money for sport in schools and the community and create 6,000 computer centres around Britain to give access to the internet. Among those waiting to hear the Prime Minister's message were millions of pensioners, of course, angry about that infamous 75p rise, and the fuel campaigners. Our correspondent June Kelly has been assessing the response in different parts of the United Kingdom.
No wonder the government has taken a knock.
A short distance away from the conference centre, members of this pensions group in Brighton listened as Tony Blair said that his government had got the message over pensions. But they still don't think that Labour are offering them enough.
I'm not pleased about it. I want to hear the fact the restoration of the link is what pensioners want all over the country. We want the restoration of the link.
I think maybe they have listened. I think it's maybe got through to them. They haven't put everything right by not restoring the link. But it's very important that they do realise there are 10.8 million pensioners.
Monmouthshire farmer David Handy is the head of Farmers for Action, one of the groups which spearheaded the fuel protests. He was looking for help from the Prime Minister. Had he got it?
Well, pretty disappointed. I thought that he may have at least altered the tone of his voice and language in respect to the fuel crisis. Instead of that, he came over to me as being completely arrogant and not even giving a damn about my industry or the haulage industry.
It's now 3 weeks since the fuel protesters seized the political agenda by the scruff of the neck and left the government floundering. Robert Burns, a haulier from West Lothian, was at the forefront of the Grangemouth blockade in Scotland. After this afternoon's speech, he too is furious with Tony Blair.
I think if I was him, I would have done something today to generally put the public's mind at a little bit of ease that he was going to do something. Obviously he didn't do that, so maybe he's not listening just quite hard enough yet. Maybe there have to be something else done before he listens completely.
So the threat of another fuel crisis remains, and the clock is ticking towards the protesters' 60-day deadline. June Kelly, BBC News.
And with me here in Brighton, I'm pleased to say, is the Home Secretary, Jack Straw. Thanks for joining us, Mr Straw. Can I deal with yob culture, so-called, first of all? We've heard a bit about zero tolerance in the past. Now, this time, are you going to actually deliver? Are you going to get results, not just words?
Well, we are delivering, for example, on burglary and car crime, because we've targeted them, and both of those are down by between a quarter and a fifth since the election. What we're moving on to do now is to target this kind of yobbery, which is intolerable to so many people, and that means improving the powers that the police have, allowing them to issue these fixed penalty notices, which have proved very effective so far as motoring offences are concerned, and toughening up on the court's powers on people who abuse bail. And overall, it's about making for a more orderly and therefore a more tolerant society.
And briefly on this, before I move on, are you going to carry the police with you on this? They've been a little iffy in the past on some of your initiatives.
No, I think you'll find they're very keen on this, and they're very keen too on the 20% cash increase in spending we're providing for the police over the next 3 years.
Let's widen a little and talk about the speech itself. It was well received here. Can I put it to you that lots of people will say that a government that admits it's made some bad mistakes and that it's had a bit of a crisis over the last month has a bit of a cheek asking for a second term?
I think we've not got a cheek at all, but we are human, we have made mistakes, and life is a learning process. But the important point of the speech was this, that Tony laid out the real achievements of this government. This country's economy has not become the 4th largest in the world by accident. We've not got rid of the public sector deficit by accident, but as a result of tough measures that were taken by Gordon Brown and Tony in the early stages of this government. And as a result of that, we are now laying the grounds for really major investment in education, in health, in my area, the police and crime fighting, and in transport. And what Tony's speech also did was lay out the very clear choice before the electorate, whether we go on building on what we think is a very substantial element of success, or whether people move into the area of xenophobia, prejudice, and a Conservative Party which is obsessed about tax cuts, which won't go to very many people, before investment in public services.
How do you convince the voters in time for the election next year, whenever it is, that you've learned the mistakes of the last few weeks and that you're not an arrogant government as many people seem to think you are?
Well, we're not arrogant, or I think that one of the problems about being in government is that it's too easy to appear to be out of touch with the electorate. How we convince them is by this kind of speech and building on the huge investment in vision and mission and in delivery that Tony Blair set out today.
Mr. Straw, thanks very much for joining us. Good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Now, we'll be back in Brighton later in the programme. Time now to join Fiona in London for the rest of the day's news.
Thanks, Hugh. The former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, Lord Archer, has been charged with perjury and perverting the course of justice. The charges follow claims that he asked a friend to lie for him during a libel trial 13 years ago. If Lord Archer is found guilty, he faces a jail sentence. The allegations came to light during his campaign to become Lord Mayor of London and effectively ended his political career. Our correspondent Rory McLean reports.
Lord Archer, how did the meeting go?
2 charges of perjury, 2 charges of perverting the course of justice, and 1 count of using a false document. The 61-year-old millionaire and novelist left the South London police station where he'd been charged without commenting.
A special inquiry team from Scotland Yard's SO6 unit, the Fraud Squad, have been investigating allegations against Lord Archer since last November.
Lord Archer had won the internal party vote to become the Conservative candidate for the Mayor of London election. But after only 8 weeks campaigning, he resigned and was later expelled from the Tory party following serious allegations made against him by a former friend. That friend, Ted Francis, on the left here,
as I said before, there's no further comment. I've made the
was also charged today with 1 count of perverting the course of justice. He had claimed that Lord Archer asked him to lie for him, saying they'd been together on an evening that was likely to be relevant to the libel trial in 1987, at which Lord Archer won substantial damages from the Daily Star newspaper over claims he'd slept with a prostitute. The charges against Lord Archer have come as he opens his new play, A Murder Mystery. He spoke to the BBC yesterday. He wouldn't comment on the case against him, but would talk about his new work. Its resonance was clear.
Everyone who comes will decide whether the accused, that's the title of the play, is guilty or not guilty. And at the end of the play, there are 2 different endings after you've made your decision. We don't know what decision you'll make. We've got 2 different endings. But you will find out the truth.
This is yet another chapter in the life of one of the most irrepressible characters in the British public eye. He'll appear in court next week facing the most serious charges, carrying a sentence of up to life imprisonment. Rory McLean, BBC News.
A key prosecution witness has been giving evidence at the trial of 2 Libyans accused of the Lockerbie bombing. The witness, a former double agent working for Libya and the CIA, said one of the accused kept explosives in an office at Malta's international airport. He's identified both Libyans as the men responsible for the terrorist attack.
In one of these cars, we haven't been told which, is a witness from Libya who could decide the outcome of Britain's biggest murder trial. Security is tighter than usual here, because the witness being guarded, Abdul Majid, was once a Libyan secret agent who then defected to America and now fears that his former Libyan colleagues want to kill him.
And from behind a screen, with his voice disguised electronically, Abdelmajid told the court how Libyan intelligence planned the bombing. He claimed that the two accused, Abdel Basit al-Magrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fima, were fully involved. In his evidence here, Abdelmajid described how back in 1986, in the wake of the American bombing of the Libyan capital Tripoli, he was given a special task to find out if unaccompanied baggage could be smuggled onto a British passenger plane. He found out that he could, but was told by one of the two accused here, don't rush things. 2 years later, the Pan Am jet was destroyed. It was at Malta airport, Abdelmajid said, that he was shown high explosives stored in the Libyan Airlines office, and how he saw the two accused handling a brown suitcase, like the one placed on board Pan Am 103. Abdelmajid claimed that before the bombing, he passed all this on to his CIA handlers. The relatives of the victims are appalled.
We want to know who decided to murder the people on that plane. We want to know why the plane was only 2/3 full, for God's sake, and we want to know why it wasn't prevented from happening.
On this, the 50th day of the trial, the relatives heard the clearest link yet between the accused and the bombing. But they're now asking new questions about whether the authorities could have done more to stop the attack in the first place. David Shrukman, BBC News at the Scottish Court in the Netherlands.
And the time has just gone 6:15. In a few moments, £40,000 for the woman who came back from the dead. Hundreds of thousands of TESA account holders could be eligible for compensation. In a quarter of an hour, Scotland's main stories. We also hear from the Rangers team in Turkey and the internet revolution, how more and more Scots are putting their money where their mouse is. And more cash from Down Under to do up the world's oldest clipper. A woman who'd been certified dead, though she was just in a diabetic coma, has received nearly £40,000 compensation in an out-of-court settlement. Maureen Jones had been pronounced dead by a doctor and was about to be carried off in a hearse. But a police constable saw her leg twitch and managed to revive her.
Maureen Jones battled for years to get compensation for the death declaration. She cannot erase the awful memory, even though she's moved to the seaside.
Things aren't, good. If you wake during the night and you can't get back to sleep, all you think about is, being buried alive and things like that. But I would much rather live in Bridlington than Twing. I just have to come to terms with it, with what's happened. But it is hard, very hard.
Maureen collapsed in a diabetic coma at her home in the village of Thwing. Her son found her face down in her bedroom. He called Dr. Marion Meeson, a local GP, who declared his mother dead. But 30 minutes later, as a hearse pulled up outside, two police officers checking the body saw Maureen's leg twitch.
Common sense would say that the body was now alive, but the whole situation was quite surreal. So what I just said to the son was, I think that your mother's alive. And we went further than that. I said, listen, I don't know what's happened, but what I want you to do is sit on the bed and hold your mother's hand and just talk to her.
Maureen Jones came round in hospital 2 days later. But because of the episode, she says she and her children have been to hell and back.
I even got to the point where I didn't believe my family. I thought they were against me. Because they were, as I thought, being nasty, wanting it all to finish. But I can understand it now. I've had more than enough.
Maureen Jones remains bitterly resentful of her traumatic experience. The doctor, Marion Meeson, ruled negligent by a judge and reprimanded by her employers, continues to work as a rural GP after undergoing extra training. John Thorne, BBC News, Yorkshire.
And viewers in the north of England can see more of Maureen Jones's story later on Look North. There's been violence on the streets of the Czech capital Prague, with angry demonstrations against meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Thousands of protesters campaigning against globalisation through stones and homemade explosives at police guarding the meetings. From Prague, Peter Morgan reports.
Tear gas and water cannon rained down upon the anti-capitalist forces laying siege to the World Bank and IMF meetings in Prague. rioters ripped cobblestones from the streets and hurled them at the police.
Violence was predicted for Prague, and it's been delivered by a hard core of demonstrators who know that by attacking the World Bank, they can achieve a worldwide audience.
Casualty numbers are uncertain but are growing, with little sympathy from the demonstrators for the policemen who they've hurt.
Well, good. I hope more of them get injured, because that's what it's about. It's taking the fight right to where it belongs. To the puppets of the fascist state and who protect the World Trade Organization, IMF, and every other capitalist and fascist organisation.
The peaceful thousands marching for debt relief in the developing world have had their campaign eclipsed, just as the World Bank has had its pleas for dialogue ignored.
We feel that nobody wins if you shut down a meeting that is discussing AIDS, that is discussing the environment. So we're looking for dialogue, not diatribes.
But that hope appears forlorn as the barricades burn around the conference centre this evening. Peter Morgan, BBC News in Prague.
In Yugoslavia, the first results have come in from Sunday's presidential election. Results from Montenegro indicate victory for President Milosevic there, but it's thought 2/3 of people boycotted that vote. Overall, the opposition are still confident of a clear victory. The streets of the capital, Belgrade, were quiet today after thousands of opposition supporters gathered in the centre overnight to celebrate their apparent success. Western governments are calling on Mr. Milosevic to admit defeat and step down peacefully. Hundreds of thousands of people who hold Tesla accounts may be entitled to financial compensation after being locked into low rates of interest by their banks and building societies. The Financial Ombudsman has decided that it's unfair for banks to pay low rates of interest while penalising customers who move their accounts elsewhere.
Savers rushed to pour £34 billion into Teslas before last May, when they were replaced by the new tax-free accounts called ISAs. Since then, many Tesla savers have been angered to see their Teslas getting lower rates of interest than everyday savings accounts. That's on top of having their money locked in by financial penalties and notice periods. The Financial Ombudsman has decided this practice is unfair, and account holders could be entitled to compensation if they were never told they could move their money to get a better deal.
Some people with Tesla accounts have been led to believe that they've got to keep their money with the same bank or building society. They haven't been told they can take it away freely. If, in consequence of that, the bank or building society has paid them an inappropriately low rate of interest, they may be entitled to compensation.
The attitude of some Tesla providers has led to more than 12,000 complaints. Savers who feel their high street bank or building society may have given them a raw deal on their Tesla should complain first to that bank or building society. If they're still not satisfied, they should go to the Financial Ombudsman. The compensation could be hundreds of pounds. Andrew Verity, BBC News.
Drugs are continuing to cast a long shadow over the Olympic Games. One of the world's best-known female athletes, American sprinter Marion Jones, has been defending her husband against drug allegations. CJ Hunter, an American shot putter, tested positive for the banned steroid nandrolone before the Olympics. Meanwhile, a Romanian gymnast has been stripped of a gold following a doping offence.
CJ Hunter is reigning world shot put champion. He had been considered favourite for the Olympic title here in Sydney, but he withdrew from the Games, saying he'd injured his knee. Today, in an emotional news conference in Sydney, he denied that he'd taken drugs. He's tested positive 4 times for the bodybuilding drug nandrolone.
I don't know what has happened, but I can promise everybody that I'm going to find out.
The case would not have received all the publicity had he not been married to the world record sprinter Marion Jones. She backed her husband today.
And I am here pretty much to show my complete support for my husband. Aside from him being an athlete and me being an athlete, he's my husband, and I'm here to show support for him.
There is no suggestion that Jones has taken drugs. She's won the Olympic 100 metres gold, but how much the drugs allegations have affected her ambition to win a record 5 gold medals will become clear in the next few days. A Romanian gymnast, Andrea Raducan, who's been dubbed the new Nadia Comaneci, has been stripped of a gold medal for drug abuse. Raducan tested positive for a stimulant, which it's claimed she took in a cold remedy. She's the 4th athlete to have a medal taken away. It is the measure of a renewed campaign against drug abuse that there have been more positive drugs cases here than at any previous Olympics. Adam Minot, BBC News at the Sydney Games.
An oil tanker captain who had to be rescued while trying to return to his ship from a drinking session ashore has been found negligent and incompetent and had his licence suspended until early next year. But a tribunal ruled today that it was an isolated incident in Captain Clive Mottram's career and declared him fit to serve at sea.
Guilty of misconduct and negligence, but Captain Clive Mottram left today's tribunal knowing he'll be allowed to command a ship again. It was he who was held primarily responsible for the drinking session ashore that rendered him and his crew incapable of sailing back to the 50,000-ton oil tanker at anchor 13 miles away. They had to be winched to safety in a force 7 gale after crashing their dinghy into the harbour wall and running out of fuel.
Their conduct was said to be not befitting of officers, such senior officers, in command of the ship and in engine rooms. And that was ultimately the finding of the inquiry today.
Another crew member, Chief Engineer John Blamires, will also get his licence back in November. The tribunal chairman said there was no evidence that either of the men had behaved in such a way before or would do so again. Therefore, they were not generally unfit to discharge their duties. But he also said there should now be a general policy of zero tolerance of alcohol for those in command at sea, and that should be extended to include those in charge of even smaller leisure craft. Jane O'Brien, BBC News, Southampton.
Now we'll go back to Hugh at the Labour Party conference in Brighton in a moment, but first Sarah Wilmshurst here with the weather. Sarah.
Thanks very much. A very good evening to you. Well, there's some heavy rain around in places at the moment. That heavy rain will push northeastwards through tonight. Now that will eventually clear away, and then it looks like we're going to see some more very wet and windy weather heading in from the west through tomorrow. Now we'll see gale force winds in some parts of the west, particularly in exposed locations, and possibly some localised flooding. And looking ahead, well, it's going to stay unsettled. More on that in the next half an hour. Now you can see on the radar picture that it's pretty wet across Scotland and Northern Ireland at the moment, but the heaviest rain, some thunderstorms too, are affecting parts of Wales, particularly the south and the west of Wales. So there is a severe weather warning in force here, a possibility of some localised flooding and some really hazardous driving conditions. And we're expecting that wet weather to push northeastwards through tonight, then it'll dry out for a while before that next batch of rain pushes in from the west through the day tomorrow. Some heavy rain in places, it's falling on saturated ground, so there's a distinct possibility of some localised flooding. So a dry start in the east, that wet, windy weather pushing west, top temperature 18. Now over to Hugh in Brighton.
Sarah, many thanks for that. Now, Tony Blair's speech impressed delegates, it's fair to say, beyond the usual demands of party loyalty. So let's assess the wider impact now with our political editor, Andrew Marr. Andrew, it worked here. What matters is whether it works outside.
Very difficult for us to know whether it's worked outside, of course, Hugh, because here we are sitting in a kind of enormous pagoda, if you like, floating across the countryside, full of political obsessive journalists, politicians, all talking to each other, all getting wildly overexcited, saying it was a fantastic speech, and tomorrow morning's papers will reflect that. The trouble is, none of us really know how it's affecting people as they sit watching. Are they getting that extraordinarily strong message from Blair, I'm sorry, I fouled up, I understand, or not?
Well, in a way, I suppose, he set up the shape of the next election campaign for us.
Very interesting there. What he's going to do, clearly, is to try and pin on the Conservative Party those huge public spending cuts that Labour claim they're about, and divide it down to every constituency will be told, little Piddlewick in the Marsh, you're going to lose your General Hospital, or you're going to lose X number of politicians. William Hague's not very impressed by that. He's saying that Tony Blair's the best actor in British politics, and he's after an Oscar for least listening politician tonight. So a lot more of that to come next week, Hugh.
Andrew, many thanks for that. Now, that's it. That's the news from Brighton. There's one big story this evening. Elsewhere, Jeffrey Archer has been charged with perjury and perverting the course of justice. That relates to a court case some 13 years ago. There'll be another update for you, as usual, of course, just before 7 o'clock. Here in Brighton, at the Labour Party conference, Tony Blair has admitted that his government's mistakes have been regrettable, and he set out New Labour's claim for a second term in office. From all of the 6 o'clock team in Brighton and in London, very good evening to you.